So, you know by now that you are expected to respond to something that you're reading each week in the form of a response letter. And I've given you a menu of choices. One of the things that helps me make sure that I'm not always using the same choice again and again is to put the title of the book that I use for a particular response and the date that I use the response. That way I hope to try as many of the choices as I can. Now what I want to do for my second letter is move over to the nonfiction choices. And all of this can be very overwhelming. But I want to go ahead and just start and focus in on that one single choice. And so here's what I'm going to work with. This is referring to details and examples in a text when I'm explaining a text what the text says explicitly, and when I'm drawing inferences. I chose this because I know as readers we've had a lot of practice in just pulling out a quote or single piece of information. Now, one of the other things that I'm really working with you on in class is reading a text more than one time. With the first reading, you're getting the gist of the text. You're really thinking about the author's purpose. With the second reading, that's where you're looking for those significant moments or ideas, and you're really thinking about your annotating. And then finally, with a third reading, you're going back to really look at specific parts for themes, patterns, or connections and relationships. Those things that you're noticing. It's where your metacognition kicks into action. Now, of course, I don't expect you to read an entire book multiple times. I'm looking for those shorter pieces because we want to be thinking deeply. And so again, if you're doing these things, really what you get down to the end is you're repeating your thinking processes as you're answering text-dependent questions. We've been working on those race responses. What I want to show you today is how I can use race to help me plan for a solid response. Now, the article that I chose to read is one that I actually modeled for a comprehension connections notebook and how to do a race response. It is a teeny tiny short excerpt that I've pulled from National Geographic Travelers magazine about all jazzed up in West Africa. Now, I just kind of copied that piece from the text just because I wanted to write all over it and mark it up. And so with my first reading, I thought about the author's purpose, and it was really just to kind of inform me and possibly entertain me and get me interested. I could think about it persuading me to want to travel to this place in Africa. When I went back a second time, there were a lot of things that stood out. I circled quite a few words because it seemed to help me start to notice something. Words like reemerge, transformation, restoration, and resurrected. These things continually jumped out at me. Then I started noticing specific words that connected to New Orleans. So, of course, I came up with those. So thinking about that race response, really what you're going to do is go back to the prompt. In this case, you're not necessarily answering a question, but you are answering the prompt. And so I think about my R from that particular article. Well, I read Jazzed Up in West Africa, noticed some interesting information. The author had a lot of great details, and I made a connection. I'll wrap it up. This right here is just like my introduction because I'm going to tell you what I'm reading and some things about it and how I'm responding to the prompt. Then I went through and I thought about how I'm answering that prompt. Well, the purpose of reading the article, that's what I'll write about. How the map really helped me better understand the text. How those words like reemergence helped me think about what was really going on. And then I want to compare it to the experience I had in New Orleans. So that's how I'm addressing that answer part. When it comes to citing evidence, I'm going to plan to find all the evidence that compares this place to New Orleans, and these are all the different things that I've noted. In this case, I didn't actually pull out entire sentences, but rather keywords, and it's okay to do that. I'm still using those quotation marks to tell that this is evidence I've cited. Then finally, when I go to explain all of the evidence, that's where that connection comes in. How did these words from the text help me remember my experience? How did the writer of the text give me mental images? Now I'm really understanding what the city in Senegal is like. And so here's what's really cool about me using race as a planning guide. I don't think I can fit it all in easily. Now that I have race, here I have my introduction, paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3 already lined out. Then, as I showed you before with the conclusion, really all you're doing in a conclusion is restating what's important from each of your 3 paragraphs. So here I've went ahead and written the introduction to my letter. I'm going to go ahead and just reread it and then check to make sure that I have what I planned in here. Planning is a great strategy, helps things flow quicker, but then what I can do is just go back and check to make sure I didn't leave anything out. So, first sentence, I read a short article from National Geographic Traveler called All Jazzed Up in West Africa by Douglas Rogers. On a side note, anytime you're using something from a periodical, the title of the magazine always gets underlined, and then the article actually gets quotation marks. So, I've already stated main idea. What am I doing? I read this article. Then I went on to say that I noticed some interesting information as I read. The author provided some great details about St. Louis, Senegal, and Africa. These details really helped me make a meaningful connection. And then finally, I came up with this wrap-up. I would love to share my thinking with you. I've included all parts of my plan, so now I'm ready to move on. Now I've written the second paragraph. Here's where I used that idea of answering and the plan that I had to help me, and so I'll just go back and quickly check. My first sentence says, the purpose of this article was to inform the reader about the reemergence or rebuilding of this city. I found the small map helpful because I was confused by the reference in the text to an island in the river. There were many references to how St. Louis, Senegal was transformed or restored. One person even said visitors compare the city to New Orleans. And then I wrapped it up with, I would agree based on the evidence I found to connect to. So now I've moved on to the next part in my response, and this is where I really cited the evidence. Let's take a look. I start with saying that there are several details in the article that reminded me of what I saw when I traveled to New Orleans. Now, here I've got a lot of different evidence cited, and I didn't use it exactly in this order, but rather I put it together with the way it seemed to best fit. So I started with, since NOLA is right by the Mississippi River, I saw riverboats. There is a historic quarter in NOLA too, called the French Quarter. And this area of New Orleans has row houses with wrought iron balconies, as well as cafes. When walking around, I could see and feel the flamboyance and Creole culture. Finally, I know NOLA is famous for jazz festivals because I saw ads for events and I heard jazz music playing almost everywhere. The references to St. Louis, Senegal remind me of NOLA, and that's how I wrapped it up, and I'll be ready to move on to my next paragraph, which is where I'm going to explain those connections. So I move on to the E part. Here's where I took my evidence and now I'm explaining it. So, all jazzed up, really connected to my travel experience in New Orleans. The words in the article help me remember my own trip. As I read the article, I was able to get clear mental images because I could make a strong personal connection. Therefore, I think I really understand what the city of St. Louis, Senegal must be like. And then I wrap this up with, I have never been there, but my connection makes me feel like I have. And so I have all those parts. Now, as I was writing this particular paragraph, I got to thinking that it kind of sounds like I'm concluding all of my thoughts anyways. And so I'm going back and I'm looking. I do have some very strong paragraphs. I think that this paragraph probably does well to wrap up everything I need to say and conclude it. So, in this case, I don't think that I will write an extra paragraph to conclude. I think I'll go ahead and sign my letter and wrap it up. Is it okay not to write a conclusion? Sure. It's just you need to make sure that you're ending your reader with something that kind of wraps up all of your thinking. I think I really did there.